Live, and privileged to have Mike DeCourcey join us from the Sporting News, Big Ten Network, Fox, so you name it. And if it's college basketball, it's Mike DeCourcey. And Mike, you weren't up maybe as late as Brian was last night. I think he was at 3:24. But an impressive performance last night by Purdue, taking care of Indiana in pretty good order last night. Your impressions of not only last night, but where this Purdue basketball team is?
Well, I thought it was their best performance of the season. The Michigan State win showed a great amount of spirit, but and obviously the capability to generate what they did in the second half, all of which was needed to get over the difficult first half. But in this game, they had everything they needed in order to be successful. They did a great job. The thing I think that when I watched that game, the thing that I found most impressive was the commitment to walling off the interior of Indiana. If Indiana got the ball to the lane, they were going to face multiple defenders. They were going to be walled off and they were not going to give up easily access to the basket. And if you attempted a shot, they were going to do a great job of boxing out and making sure you only got one. They did a magnificent job of that. And obviously, when you shoot the basketball as well as they did, that's a big advantage. That's a big help. But you're not always going to go 11 for 17 from three-point range. But you can hold Indiana to 8 offensive rebounds total and Trace Jackson-Davis to only 2. You have a great chance to win the basketball game if that's who you're playing. And not everybody plays it that way, that throws the ball inside and is reliant upon the inside game as Indiana is. But there are lots of teams in the league that are oriented toward that have great post players. Michigan has great post players. Illinois has great post players. Obviously, Iowa with what you get from Luka Garza. So if you're as committed to executing that defense in subsequent games as you were against the Hoosiers last night, that's a big advantage.
Mike, I'm not just asking this question based off of last night, and it might seem a little odd, but last night I think it came to the forefront in my mind is, Purdue has gotten so much of a payout from the commitment Matt Painter made years ago to having shooters all over his roster, recruiting a shooter in every recruiting class. And I think when you look at the difference between Purdue and Indiana right now, Trace Jackson-Davis is really hard to guard individually, but Indiana collectively isn't as hard to guard as Purdue might be because they have so many guys who can shoot the basketball. Why doesn't everyone do that?
I don't understand it really. I especially with the way the game has evolved. The emphasis on 3-point output that has overtaken the NBA to the point where, that's the biggest part of what they do at the NBA level. So I don't understand why teams don't pay greater attention to that in recruiting. I remember watching Ryan Smith in a tournament back in Cincinnati at the Shoemaker.
Takes 5, yeah.
Yeah,
I was there.
and
Ohio
he
Gators.
became, and I wrote about him that weekend. He became Ryan Smith, so to speak. And it sort of really changed his trajectory because at that point, as I recall, he was mostly being recruited by the MAC. And then he came out and started busting threes in that tournament. And he started getting offers from other places. I remember right. I could be wrong about this, but I think UCLA might have even sniffed around a little bit. And ultimately he decided on Purdue and he had a terrific career. I think you have to do that in this game.
Yeah.
In the modern game, you have to have guys who can make shots. And if you had to rank what you need in your program, not in each recruiting class, but you better have a point guard who knows how to play the game and can get the ball where you want to go. It really helps to have a rim protector, somebody who's big enough to make it really difficult to get easy access to the goal. And then you better have a shooter. And I would say that of those 3, that the shooter probably ranks second now and isn't that far from overtaking the point guard in importance. Rim protector is a nice thing to have. But Indiana won a lot of games without having size in the inside now. But last night they couldn't win. They couldn't win because they couldn't make shots. So they either didn't get good enough shots, or Purdue did a good enough job of sealing off that perimeter, or the guys they usually trust to make threes didn't do it, or they took more difficult shots than they needed to based on impatience or on Purdue defending it all the way to the end. And there was a little of all that involved in that effort. But you go 3 of 18 and the other team goes 11 of 17. It's like Steelers turning it over 5 times and not getting it back. You're not winning that game. I mean, it just doesn't work like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Travion Williams obviously is turning himself really into a consistent, at least especially in the second half. But he's just becoming an all Big Ten level guy. Put him in context of what, you obviously watch the league closely. He's a different kind of guy. Is he to some extent Purdue's secret sauce as the Boilermakers move through the Big Ten schedule?
Yeah, I think that what he gives you is such a great variety on offense, because the thing that, when I was watching them, I'm like, okay, you're not ever doubling him. And why don't you ever double him? Well, if you double him from the perimeter, especially on a night last night, I mean, Purdue's shooting 11 of 17 from 3, so you can't do that. What if you go big to big and trap him? Well, one, he can move your trap a little bit because he's so powerful. But even more important is his passing ability. He is a very gifted passer. That one pass he made last night that wound up over the baseline.
Yeah.
It wasn't an advised pass, but I mean, not very many big guys could even think about executing that pass. It wasn't very well advised, and he did throw it a little hard. And maybe if the other guy had any idea that he would ever throw that pass, he might have been able to catch it. But that he even has the ability. I think it was Gillis that wasn't able to.
Yeah, I think so.
Right. But the fact that Travion was even able to conceive of it is an indicator of how gifted he is as a passer. So that's what makes him so difficult. I mean, obviously he's a great finisher and all of that, but he's not limited to that. He has a complete game that makes him very difficult for opposing big guys to defend.
Yeah.
Mike, what's the biggest difference you've seen from Purdue from the start of the season to now, you think?
Well, I think the biggest thing is the consistency of their perimeter game. I think that getting that output. Now, I mean, some of that's based on 3 halves of basketball, right? I mean, the second half of Michigan State and then the 2 last night. Because if we went back to the first 20 minutes against Michigan State, you'd be fretting about everything that wasn't working. So you have to be able to continue to do these things that they've done well. And it's not easy to do that in the Big Ten. I mean, I looked at Indiana's schedule as I was preparing for my segment on Fox Sports last night. And they have 2 Iowas. They have a Michigan. I think they might have a Michigan State in there. That's the easy game.
Yeah.
It's a crazy stretch they're running into. And then you look at Purdue and you say Penn State, Ohio State, Michigan, Minnesota, Maryland, then Northwestern. And in the rest of the college basketball world, everybody's like, wow, we have to go through that. And in the Big Ten, you're like, that's what passes for not the highest mountain. I mean, you've got Michigan in the middle of that, and you've got to go to Ohio State, and Minnesota's good, and Maryland's tough, and Penn State's been very dynamic. They just haven't been able to get on the floor. But those are some of the lesser teams in this league. That's how it is. So I think the key for Purdue is to be able to go against those teams and perform. And the results take you where they take you. And hopefully you get your share of the results. But you can't let the difficulty of the challenge dictate how you perform. You have to continue to perform. You have to continue to execute. You can't let the difficulty, if you lose a couple, you can't let that define your next effort. And I think that's what maybe they learned in those first 20 minutes against Michigan State, because they came out and played so poorly, but they didn't let that define how they were going to perform in the second half. They came out and they played great. And given the deficit that they had created for themselves, it might not have been enough, but it was. And so you have to continue to deliver those performances and expect that they'll be enough.
Yeah, that's a good point. Bracketology has become your other day job. I mean, doing that. I know you have Purdue as a number 1 seed. No, I mean, in all seriousness, and it's early, and I get that. It's crazy though. The Big Ten so strong. There's maybe only 1 or 2 teams that are really out of contention right now. I mean, it's just that tight. Would you look at it that way? And where do you see Purdue maybe down the road if the Boilermakers can continue to play at a high level?
Yeah, I first of all, I would say only 1 is out of contention, Alan, and that would be Nebraska. Penn State, the problem, we don't really know because they haven't been able to get on the floor lately. They've only still played, I think, 5 games, maybe 6. Whatever the number is, it's not enough. And they are they are not, in a winning situation. They don't have a winning record, but they're capable of it if they are able to put together games, play them, and then win them. We'll see. I would say they would be the next least likely to make it, but I wouldn't rule them out. Maryland has 2 wins that stack up with anybody's. Yeah. But they're only a game over 500. So I'm not putting anybody in my field that's only a game over 500 for the reason that no one's ever made it with that mark. And I know it's still a half a year to go. And if they did the same thing in the second half, then they'd be 2 games over 500. Have made it with that. But I'm going to stick with you're 1 over, you're not eligible, so to speak. And then if you get a 2 over, then we'll talk. But then everybody else is right there in the mix. Northwestern, they got into the field at a pretty high level with their early success in the league. Now lately, the schedule has turned against them, and I have a friend who's a Northwestern fan who texts me every time they play, and I say, "What's wrong?" And they says, "What's wrong?" And I'm like, "The other team's better." And it's not that Northwestern's not good; they're just not as good as Michigan or Iowa. And so that's, and sometimes you can upset those teams, but it's not easy to do that. And then everybody else is in there. We've got the difference, I think, Alan, between last year and this, and Brian, is that last year we had 12 teams competing for bids really up until mid-February-ish, maybe late February. This year we have 13, but the difference is now you've got teams on the 1 line and teams on the 2 line and 3 line. Last year, that was not the case. When the committee did their bracket preview, which was ultimately the only statement they made about the nature of last season, there were, I think there was a 2 seed in Maryland and a 3 seed or 4 seed in Michigan State, and I think that was it, even though the league was was so incredibly deep. Now you have that high level, which is really hard to play against teams like Purdue and Indiana and Michigan State, and those that are fighting to get firmly into the field are going to keep bumping into those heavyweights. And if you can take one down the way Maryland has, great. That's terrific for you. But you also have to continue to take care of the light heavyweights, so to speak, the Marylands and Penn States and Minnesotas and such. You have to keep taking care of those because they are all great, significant teams and can beat you. It's a really tricky minefield for everybody that's trying to get in. I think if Purdue continues to perform like they have for the last 3 halves, they'll get in the field firmly. And, the ideal for you when you're in the situation now, I think Purdue will be a 10 seed in my Friday bracket. When you're in that situation, your goal is to get to 7. If you can get to 7, you can compete to play in the second weekend. If you hang around there, you're not in bad shape. But if you keep improving and wind up in an 8 or a 9, you don't want that. So you keep driving and try to get up to that 7 line or somewhere beyond. And I would certainly not rule out the team that played last night or the team that played the second half on Friday. That team can climb.
Mike, do you think there's anything uniquely different about NCAA tournament selection this year because of the unique circumstances? Some teams playing more games than others, a lot of teams losing a lot of their marquee non-conference games. road games perhaps maybe not meaning as much because there's no fans there, anything like that?
I think you have to take all of that into account. I still think a road win is more valuable than a home win. But I think ultimately what they'll get by the time we get to the end of the season is the opportunity to calculate, okay, how much harder was it to win a road game than a home game this year? Usually historically, they have a number. And that's what created the quad system, because it's easier to beat it's easier to beat a top 30 team at home or the number 31 team at home than it is to beat the number 76 team or the number 75 team on the road. And that's how you get the quads. 1 to 25, 26 to 50, and then 51 to 75. And that's how you get that circumstance where they look at it that it's more difficult to beat that number 31 team, or it's easier to beat the number 31 team, even though they're ranked and they're glamorous and the record's better. Still, statistically over time, it's easier to do that than it is to go on the road and beat a pretty good team that might rank 76 and probably is in the middle of your standings, or in this case in the Big Ten, probably at the bottom of your standings. And that's what that's created. So now they'll look at it, I think, and they'll say, okay, what's the winning percentage for home teams and road teams comparative to history? And how much should we put into that? I think they'll be able to do that. It's going to add another layer of complication. It won't be as convenient as just looking at the quads and saying, okay, we are where we are. But the other aspect that the truncated schedule generally, we're playing fewer games, we're playing fewer non-conference games. And then the truncations enforced by the pandemic, where teams have been off the court for 2-3 weeks at a time, where you have a DePaul that's only played 5 games. Those kinds of things, they create another level of complication. Although I think by the end of the year, hopefully those teams that were limited early will have continued to play late, and at least you'll have a representative sample of who the team is. You probably won't have, the leagues that play 20 games probably won't have 14 teams that play 20 games. The leagues that play 18 probably won't have 12 or 14 that play 18 games. So there'll be mismatched standings, and each of those leagues is going to have to decide, do we want to play a conference tournament? Do we want to go through that, especially with the protocols we have to go through to get ourselves established to play in the NCAAs? I'm hearing different discussions about that from different leagues all across the country about whether they're going to do that. Now, the mid and low majors are going to have to play their tournaments because they basically punted their regular season schedules. They're either barely playing, or in a lot of cases, they're playing schedules that aren't technically fair. They just want to play. So you might get 2 big time teams from your league on the road. They play back to back games, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Thursday, Friday, whatever. And then they do the same thing the next week. And there wasn't that great consideration given to, is this a fair, balanced schedule? Because in the end, you're going to get into the short conference tournament and sort it all out anyway. So those leagues, I don't have any doubt, will play some sort of conference tournaments, whether they play the whole group or the top teams or whatever, they're going to play them. But I wouldn't be surprised if you see some of the high majors and the next tier, the Americans and some of those maybe decide they might not want to as well. It's a challenge because on the one hand, you have teams that want to take their shot. And then on the other hand, you have teams at the top that are like, do we want to go through this when we know we're in? And if we end up having a virus problem during this conference tournament, that could cost us the opportunity to actually play in March Madness. So it's a real challenge for all the leagues to make those decisions. And ultimately that will add another layer of complication to, if indeed people choose not to play, it'll add another layer of complication to the committee's work.
Yeah, another thing to deal with in this crazy, crazy year that we're all trying to get through. Got about a minute left, but I wanted to ask you real quick on Mike Babinski, because you've known Mike since your days at Xavier or around Xavier in Cincinnati, when he was at Xavier, I should say. Now on the committee, what is he pretty thoughtful guy, good, really good for Purdue, not to, and probably good for the committee to have a guy of Mike's stature on the selection committee.
Well, it's in relative to Purdue. It doesn't always work out.
Oh yeah.
When you have your guy on the committee, I remember in 2011, Gene Smith was the chair of the committee, and his basketball Buckeyes were the #1 overall seed in the tournament, and they stuck him in a region with Carolina and Kentucky.
Yeah.
And those were probably two of the next, like, once you got past the first four, they were probably like the 6th best and 8th best teams in the country. I mean, it was just really stacked against the Wildcats. I mean, against the Buckeyes, and the Wildcats ended up being the rep out of there. So wouldn't count on any favors. Plus, he's got great integrity. And there is the dynamic that you're not allowed to be in the room when they're discussing the Boilermakers. But it's obviously great to have. It's really great for all of college basketball to have really smart people like Mike on the committee. Guys who understand what sports are about, understand what the tournament's about, understand how it's supposed to operate. The more Mike Babinski's and Joe Castiglione's and Jim Phillips's, we lost Jim because he's the one that Mike. But when you have people like that, the really sharpest people on the committee, and they've all cycled through, all three of those guys have cycled through at some point. That's when the committee's in great hands. And this year, the chair, Mitch Barnhart, another one of those guys who really understands college sports. And you don't have to be people always say you need more basketball on the committee, basketball people on the committee. Honestly, most of those people who have coached basketball or played basketball, a lot of them have their feelings about people they played against didn't like, or schools they played against didn't like. So really, you don't need people that understand pick and roll and box and one and all that stuff. You need people who understand sports and who won, who lost, how difficult was it to win the game, that kind of thing. There's the one thing I'll say, sort of relating to Brian, I've seen a lot of whispers about, or not whispers, but conversation about the idea that, well, with all the problems we have and this team hasn't played in many games, and we might not see this team back for another week, whatever, we'll have to depend on the eye test. Please, Lord, no. Please, no eye tests, because eye tests are nonsense. Yes, there's a subjectivity that you have to involve when you look at a list of accomplishments that a team has, and you have to grade that. But don't give me this. There was a gentleman named Stan Morrison who was a coach at Southern Cal, and he was on the committee, and he used to have this saying, okay, down at the playground, shirts and skins, who you got? And that's the worst way you can pick NCAA tournament teams, because if we could all pick the winners of every tournament, then we would all have perfect brackets. Yeah. And those $1 million prizes they give for that sort of thing, they'd go broke in 2 days. Yeah. Yeah. Everybody picked perfect brackets. Nobody has perfect eyes. You can't judge it based on that. It's the eye test is not what it's about. It's about understanding the data and interpreting the data properly. And people like Mike and Mitch and Jim Phillips and Joe Castiglione, they've always understood that. And the committee's been in great hands when those people have been on it.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Interesting. And we will maybe hit you up here as we get closer to March, because you're going to have a lot to say with where this is all going to play out. Mike, thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Always great to get your wisdom on college